Well, there's an article that I'm sure caught most Phillies fans' eyes as they glanced on their Twitter page, Blue Sky page, whatever it is you use to look at the internet. Article by Jayson Stark about the Phillies here and their quest in 2025 to finally get over the hump and win the World Series. Excellent article in The Athletic. It's called "As the Phillies Eye a World Series Ring, Is Their Arrow Pointing Up or Down?" And of course, the author of that article, Jayson Stark, fantastic Hall of Fame writer for The Athletic, joins us here on the podcast, also host of the Starkville Pod. I hope you all listen to that on a regular basis. Follow him on X at JasonST. Jayson, welcome back to Hititn Season. How are you?
Hey, John. I'm doing great, my friend. How's everything?
I'm great. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, especially after a big article like this, really zeroing in on the Phils, because this obviously touches on the question that so many of us are wondering too. You know, there are trend lines that you can see from the last few years that would clearly indicate this team's still moving up. The trajectory is still positive. And yet there's some nagging things there that would have one believe that maybe it's moving down. So kind of first, if you can lay out, let's start off on a positive note. What are some reasons that you see that this team is still on the way up, that the arrow is pointing in the right direction?
Yeah, it's funny how this is not the take that you'll hear much on talk radio.
No.
You know, we both understand how Philly fans' minds tick.
Yes.
So, totally get it. But there is another side. And I think if I was going to sum it up, John, I'd say this, that in baseball especially, large samples tell us more than small samples. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So if you look at the large samples, it feels like the Phillies are almost an underrated team, and that they're actually getting better because over the last 6 full seasons, they have increased their win total in every one of those seasons. And how many teams in the history of the National League have ever done that? The answer is one, the Phillies. This right. Phillies team is the only one. And there's only been 2 American League teams that have ever done it. The thing that separates them, of course, is that those American League teams are the Royals and the Yankees, and both those teams won a World Series along the way. And as you might have noticed, the Phillies have not won one. So that's certainly a thing to think about. The other is, I feel like I hear a narrative that the Phillies, for whatever reason, are not built for October. And yet, over the last 3 years, no team has won more postseason games or postseason series than, guess who? The Phillies. So right. it feels like they're a team on the rise and they're built for October, except when they're not.
And that's the duality of this team that I think is so interesting, because you had in 2022 a Phillies team that, let's be honest, did not have the best regular season, really struggled to get into the playoffs. I remember 2 weeks before the end of the season, I think there was a series loss in Chicago, right before they went to Washington for that big series in the rainstorm. And I ripped the team because it didn't look like they had it, and they were going to have to blow it all up. And then I think you pointed to the turning point, that Game 1 win against the Cardinals in the division series where it all turned around. And then they played their best baseball of the season in October until they ran out of gas in that Astros series. I mean, they were as clutch a team as you could find. And now these last 2 years, they've been kind of labeled with the team that can't get over the hump, that can't win in the big moments. And I think that's really interesting. It's the same players. They've performed in the biggest moments, and they've also not performed in the biggest moments.
Yeah, I do think when you look at their pitching, especially their starting pitching, I don't know how anybody would say they're not built for October.
Right.
When you look at some of the moments, especially at Citizens Bank Park, across those Octobers, you would obviously see they were built for the moment. If Craig Kimbrell had never been a Philly, they would have won the World Series already.
Yeah, that's true.
And if I don't know what was going on with the Mets and their ability to beat up on the best bullpens in the game last year, but suppose Pete Alonso never hits the home run and the Brewers come in. How would last October have unfolded? It's fun to live in the what-if world. It turns out it's probably more fun than the actual world that Phillies fans lived in. But there was such plausible scenarios where the way we're talking now doesn't mean anything. But the fact that there were also common threads in the way they got beat in those postseasons is another big talking point. Yeah, you just have to be more disciplined and have better at bats in October. I think we all agree on that.
We do, and then the question is, this veteran lineup, can a Tiger change his stripes? And I guess they're gonna have to at some point, either that or overcome it with more home runs than anyone could possibly imagine. You do note some trend lines that could indicate that maybe things are moving downward, and kind of like if you could expand on some of those, like what are some of the reasons maybe not to believe we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think the biggest one concerns age, and I don't know that the Phillies are old. As I pointed out, they're certainly not Clint Eastwood and Dick Van Dyke. Okay, but they're built to have a group of players get, I don't know, regular playing time, certainly, whether it's 500 at-bats or whatever, this year. That's concerning, okay? So if you look at the way their team's constructed, you would expect that they would have at least 5 centerpiece position players in their age 32 season or older get 500 plate appearances, correct? Harper, Turner, J.T. Realmuto, Schwarber, Nick Castellanos.
Yeah.
And I was shocked to see this, that only 2 teams in history have made it to the postseason with 6 full-time players, 32 or older, getting 500 plate appearances. The 82 Angels, that was one. The other was the 2007 Yankees. That's it in history. And when I started running that past these guys in the clubhouse, they kind of rolled their eyes. And so I started fiddling around and noticed if you even lowered the bar to 450 plate appearances, all of a sudden your list goes from 2 teams to 12 teams, including the 2011 Phillies, one of the great teams ever assembled here that just matched up with the wrong team in October. And so I don't know what that means, but age is becoming a thing for that team. And that's really my point.
I thought one of the other really interesting stats that you mentioned in this story, you asked how many teams in the division play era, which is from 1969 until now, have lost a World Series in 1 year and then run up a better record each of the next 2 seasons and then come out on the other end without a World Series ring. And you mentioned the Cleveland Indians from 97 to 99, that of course Manny Ramirez, Jim Thome, Carlos Baerga, those teams. The 2010 to 2012 Texas Rangers, of course the team that lost to David Freese. And then the Detroit Tigers from 2012 to 2014 with Miguel Cabrera. And I think to me, that's the scariest version of this, because you look at that Dave Dombrowski built team had Hall of Famers throughout that roster, and they still couldn't get it done. I mean, it does speak to the point of just how difficult, especially now with all the extra postseason games, the extra series that you have to go through, how many things can go wrong in a short series, how these great teams may be built for October. Like, you couldn't build one any better than those Tigers teams, and yet still not win it.
Yeah, I've talked to Dave about this so many times, and Jim Leland, that they cannot believe that team never won a World Series. There was the 1 year they played in the ALCS against the Red Sox. Shane Victorino's Red Sox, by the way, and it seemed like they were going to throw a no-hitter every game, and then something would happen and they wouldn't even win that game.
Yeah.
And stuff does happen in these games, and it's just a reminder, so much of what happens is about matchups. If the Phillies in 2010 had never played the Giants, kind of their kryptonite. If the Phillies of 2011 had never played the Cardinals, the hottest team out there that had just finished playing them in a 4-game series a couple of weeks earlier, how does that turn out? And then there's always that bounce of the ball. I've often said, John, it would be a great 30 for 30 to do a documentary called One Bounce of the Ball, and that bounce of the ball that changes everything in the course of a postseason. That you mentioned the 2022 Phillies having that 6-run inning in St. Louis. right? The Gene Segura hit on a ball 3 feet outside the strike zone.
Right, right.
Right? It changed the course of history. They win that game. They win that series. They go home in the middle of that Atlanta series, and the entire atmosphere at Citizens Bank Park changes. And it's gone from that moment, that bounce of the ball, to where we are today. And that can still happen. Obviously, these players are talented enough where they get matched up with the right team, or that bounce goes for them, and they're the team that wins the World Series. But like, you are what your record says you are, and what your October record says you are, and it's not fair in some ways, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it fair that, I know Dombrowski said in your story that, I hope for our benefit and the players' benefit that we win a world championship with this group, because if we do, you'll be looking at one of the greatest periods in Phillies history. And if not, people will say, geez, they never got it done. So I know that there will be part of me that feels that way. I know every Phillies fan will look at that team and look at them differently than the 27 to 2011 Phillies. Another group of Phillies that is really kind of surprisingly only won the one World Series in 2008, with maybe the worst of the 5 teams that they had that went to the playoffs in those 5 straight years. Is it fair for us to look at this team, if they don't win it with Bryce Harper and Zach Wheeler and Aaron Nola in their primes and all these, and this core group here after getting so many bites at the apple, is it fair to say that, hey, that's just kind of, this can't be considered one of the truly great eras of Phillies history, or that, how do we frame it?
It's been a great ride, but has it been a great era if you don't win the World Series? I think most people would say no. And what Dave was trying to say in some incredibly honest answers, I thought, is that it's different. I don't think the window is going to close whether this team wins the World Series or not. Somebody actually stopped me at the park yesterday, because I was in Clearwater, and said, "What do you think? Is the window closing?" And I said, "I don't think it's closing, but I do think this group's legacy is on the line." And so, if they don't win, how will we look at them? Then there's a fondness in Philadelphia for the 1993 Phillies that got to the World Series but didn't win it. There's a bittersweet love affair even with the 1964 Phillies of Dick Allen and Johnny Callison and Jim Bunning. That team collapsed, and never got to play in the World Series or any kind of postseason. There is a fondness for those teams, but it's different than the way the 1980 Phillies are looked at, or the 2008 Phillies are looked at, and that's just reality. It's a very unique place you can carve out for yourself if you win the World Series. And this was another great, super honest Dave Dombrowski quote, I thought, in which he said, people don't remember who wins a division. People don't remember that team that lose the World Series. But the team that wins the World Series, everybody remembers that. And so that's what's on the line here. A lot of these players will be back. Some won't be back. And for that group, their legacy as Phillies is riding on this year. It's just that simple.
Last question before I let you go. You just mentioned you've been in Clearwater, been at the Phillies camp, talked to people in the clubhouse. And one of the things we're watching closely this spring is whether or not a couple of these guys that have been a part of this core for the last few years, specifically J.T. Realmuto and Kyle Schwarber, are going to be around after this year. There's been some rumors in the newspapers and online, if people don't read newspapers anymore, but on the computer that these guys, that there's interest on both sides in potentially extending their contracts. Are you hearing anything with regard to contract extensions with Realmuto and Schwarber?
I don't think there's an extension coming for JT. He's a catcher moving into his mid-30s, and my sense is they'll do with him what they did with him last time. If you
let it
play out, and he got all the way to free agency, and then they wound up signing him. If he's back next year, I think that's how it will work. I think Schwarber's a little different. Because he's a DH and because of what he means to the team on the field and the group off the field, there's definitely mutual interest in extending him. You haven't seen Kyle Schwarber do the Vlad Guerrero Jr. act and say, if we don't sign by 10 o'clock on this date, I'm out.
Right.
He doesn't want to be out, and they don't want him out. It's the sense I get is that it's very hard for both sides to envision a future that doesn't have Kyle Schwarber in it. The question is, how do you value a player like him who's going to be mostly a DH, correct? And if he's going to be a DH moving into his mid to late 30s, how long should the deal be? How many dollars should the deal be for? If they could construct some formula where it's almost like a self-renewing contract, every year he's good and healthy, he's back, he clicks in the next year, that would be a great structure. Whether that's reality, I don't know. But he's more likely to come out of spring training with an extension than JT, is my read.
Very interesting. And for folks who haven't read the full Athletic article that we've been talking about here on this podcast, make sure you do that. It's in the Athletic. You can find it on Jason's timeline on his X at JasonST. And don't forget to check out the Starkville podcast as well. Jayson Stark, always a pleasure to have you on Hititn Season. Thanks for coming on.
John, I always enjoy it, man. Thanks for having me.